I remember the first time I came across Jessica Dishon's story. It wasn't just another missing persons case. It was something more, a mystery that refused to be silenced, a tragedy that left a community shaken and unanswered questions lingering for years. On a quiet morning in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, the kind where the hum of daily life is just beginning, a 17-year-old high school senior gets ready to start her day, just like any other. But by nightfall, Jessica Dishon is gone. Her car, parked in the driveway. Her backpack and purse, untouched. A single shoe, discarded near the driver's seat. And her phone, left on the passenger seat with one puzzling detail. A number, 9, glowing on the screen. It's the kind of scene that makes you stop and ask yourself, what happened in those final moments? Was she taken by someone she knew? Did she leave willingly, only for something to go terribly wrong? When Jessica's body was found 17 days later, abandoned in the woods 7 miles from her home, the questions didn't stop, they multiplied. Beaten, strangled, signs of captivity. This was no random disappearance. And yet, for years, her killer walked free, hidden in plain sight. This is a story about a small town rocked by a devastating crime, a family torn apart, and a justice system struggling to keep up. But most of all, it's about the secrets people carry, the lies they tell, and the lengths they'll go to hide the truth. So I ask you, have you heard of Jessica Dishon? And if you have, what do you think really happened? Share your thoughts in the comments as we piece together the details of this haunting case. It was just another Friday morning in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, on September 10th, 1999. Jessica Dishon, a 17-year-old high school senior, was getting ready to start her day. She was bright, full of life, and had her entire future ahead of her. Her family remembers seeing her at home that morning, just as they had countless times before. But what no one knew then was that it would be the last time they'd ever see her alive. Later that day, something felt off. Jessica hadn't shown up where she was supposed to. Her parents grew worried and began looking for her. That's when they noticed her car, still parked in the driveway, as if she had never left. But inside the car, they found something that sent chills down their spines. Jessica's backpack, purse, and even her work clothes, all untouched. The scene didn't make sense. On the passenger seat, her phone was left behind, the number 9 frozen on the screen. It was a detail so strange, so out of place, it seemed like it had to mean something. And then there was the shoe, one of her shoes, sitting near the driver's seat, as if it had been tossed there. Jessica was gone, and there were no signs of where she might be. No struggle in the driveway. No note. No explanation. Just a haunting silence that left her family and the community reeling. When the police were called, their first theory was that Jessica had run away. It wasn't uncommon for teenagers to leave home in a moment of rebellion. But her family knew better. Jessica wasn't the kind of girl to disappear without telling someone where she was going. She had plans. She had responsibilities. And yet, despite the family's insistence, authorities stuck to their initial assumption. But Shepherdsville wasn't ready to give up on Jessica. Friends, neighbors, and volunteers joined the search. Posters were put up. Tips poured in. The woods were combed, and prayers were said. Still, the days passed with no sign of Jessica, and the hope of finding her alive began to fade. Now let me ask you, if you were in that driveway and found that phone frozen with the number 9 on the screen, what would you think? Could it have been a cry for help? A code? Or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because even today, The meaning of that detail remains a mystery. 17 long days passed before Shepherdsville received the news they had been dreading. On September 27, 1999, a group of searchers came upon a haunting scene deep in a wooded area, 7 miles from Jessica Dishon's home. It was there, hidden among the trees and brush, that they found her body. The discovery confirmed the fears that had gripped the town since the day she vanished. Jessica hadn't run away. She hadn't simply wandered off. What happened to her was something far more horrifying. The coroner's report painted a grim picture of her final moments. Jessica had been beaten and strangled. The injuries were brutal, deliberate, and cruel. But the most chilling detail? The evidence suggested she had been held captive for at least 1 to 2 days before her murder. During that time, it's believed she endured unimaginable suffering, torture that left marks not only on her body, but on the very fabric of the community that loved her. News of Jessica's death reverberated through Shepherdsville. This was a town where everyone knew each other, where people waved from their porches and children played freely in the streets. But Jessica's murder shattered that sense of safety. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Strangers cast suspicious glances at one another. The unspoken question lingered in every conversation. Who could have done this? Jessica's funeral drew crowds of mourners. Her classmates, teachers, neighbors, and even people who had never met her came to pay their respects. They weren't just grieving the loss of a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. They were grieving the loss of trust, of innocence, of the quiet security they had always taken for granted. The search for answers intensified. Investigators combed through evidence, desperate for leads. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, the trail grew colder. It seemed as though whoever had taken Jessica from her family had vanished without a trace. And that brings us to a question that has haunted this case for decades. Why was Jessica kept alive for those agonizing days before her death? Was it part of some twisted plan or something more opportunistic? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Could this detail hold the key to understanding the motive behind her murder? In the wake of Jessica Dishon's murder, investigators turned their attention to the people closest to her: family members, friends, neighbors. It didn't take long for suspicion to fall on a man named David "Bucky" Brooks, a neighbor who lived just a few houses down the street from Jessica's family. Bucky Brooks was a familiar face in the neighborhood, but some believed there was something off about him. His proximity to the Dishon home made him an obvious person of interest. But what really caught investigators' attention were inconsistencies in his behavior and statements following Jessica's disappearance. Law enforcement claimed there was circumstantial evidence linking Brooks to the crime. Witnesses reported seeing him near Jessica's house on the morning she vanished. Some even said he had acted unusually during the search efforts, showing more interest in the case than they thought was normal. For investigators, it was enough to make an arrest. In their eyes, Bucky Brooks might be the man who ended Jessica's life. In 2001, Bucky was charged with kidnapping and murder. His trial began 2 years later, in 2003, and for a moment, it seemed as though Jessica's family might finally get the justice they had been waiting for. But as the trial unfolded, cracks began to appear in the prosecution's case. The evidence against Bucky was thin. There were no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence tying him to the crime, and no clear motive. The case relied heavily on circumstantial details and witness testimonies that could easily be challenged. As the defense dismantled the prosecution's arguments, it became clear that the evidence simply wasn't strong enough to secure a conviction. In 2003, the trial ended in a mistrial. With no other leads, the case went cold, leaving Jessica's family heartbroken and the community frustrated. For years, the question lingered. Was Bucky Brooks guilty, or had the investigation rushed to judgment in their desperation to solve the case? Now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Bucky Brooks was a victim of a flawed investigation, or could he have been involved in Jessica's murder after all? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective could shine a light on this lingering mystery. More than a decade had passed since Jessica Dishon's murder, and the case had gone cold. The community had nearly given up hope, resigning themselves to the belief that they might never learn the truth. But in 2013, the breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an inmate serving time in a Kentucky prison. This inmate approached authorities with a startling claim. He said that Jessica's uncle, Stanley Dishon, had confessed to the murder. The details he provided were chilling. Stanley, he said, had admitted to killing Jessica because he was jealous of her relationship with a boyfriend and feared that she would expose his dark past. For years, no one had considered Stanley Dishon as a suspect. He was family, someone who had known Jessica all her life. But now, with this new lead, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that he might have been hiding a secret that ran deeper than anyone realized. As they dug into Stanley's past, a disturbing picture began to emerge. He had a history of sexual abuse, including a prior conviction for sodomy in 2005. This wasn't the first time he had been accused of hurting a young girl. Stanley's previous offenses were chilling in their own right, but now they painted a more sinister picture. Was Jessica's murder connected to a pattern of predatory behavior that had been allowed to continue within the family? The investigation revealed more than just a motive. It uncovered a man who had not only a history of violence, but a fear that his crimes would come to light. Stanley didn't want Jessica to expose him. He saw her as a threat to his hidden life. And so, he acted out of jealousy and desperation, believing that silencing her was the only way to protect himself. In January 2015, after years of denial, Stanley Dishon finally entered an Alford plea, acknowledging that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him, but still maintaining his innocence. In exchange, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter in Jessica's case and multiple counts of sexual abuse involving other family members. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 16 years. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on this. What do you think of Stanley Dishon's motive? Could his actions have been rooted in fear of exposure, or was there something deeper at play? And do you think the family could have suspected his behavior earlier? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. It's a chilling twist, and the more we examine Stanley's past, the more questions arise about what was truly going on behind closed doors. After more than 15 years of uncertainty and heartbreak, the moment of justice had finally arrived, but it wasn't exactly what anyone had expected. In January 2015, Stanley Dishon, the man who had been responsible for the murder of his niece, Jessica, entered an Alford plea. An Alford plea is a legal maneuver that allows a defendant to plead guilty to a crime while still maintaining their innocence. Essentially, it means the defendant acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them, but they do not admit guilt. In Stanley's case, he maintained that he didn't kill Jessica, but by pleading guilty, he effectively accepted the legal consequences for her death. Stanley was convicted of manslaughter in Jessica's murder, a charge that was far less severe than what many had hoped for, given the brutal nature of her death. But in addition to the manslaughter conviction, Stanley also pled guilty to multiple counts of sexual abuse, charges that involved other family members, who had suffered at his hands. These crimes had remained hidden for years, but now they came to light as part of his plea deal. On March 10, 2015, Stanley Dishon was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The weight of that sentence, however, felt light to many who had followed the case closely. The justice they had waited for had arrived, but it seemed inadequate considering the heinous nature of his crimes. Stanley's sentence came with the possibility of parole after 16 years, which meant that the earliest he could be released was in 2028, just a few years away. For Jessica's family, the sentence was a bittersweet conclusion to a long and painful journey. While they were grateful for the closure, they were left grappling with the reality that Stanley might one day walk free. Now, I want to ask you, do you think Stanley's 20-year sentence was enough, considering the nature of his crimes? Was justice served, or do you think the punishment should have been more severe? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue to reflect on this case and the questions that still remain. The conclusion of Stanley Dishon's trial and sentencing did little to ease the pain felt by Jessica's family. For years, they had lived in a state of confusion and grief, searching for answers to a murder that shattered their lives. When the truth finally emerged, it was as if the wounds were reopened, and the healing process would be far from complete. Jessica's family, especially her mother, expressed the deep toll that the case had taken on their lives. The emotional weight of losing a beloved daughter, niece, and cousin in such a brutal manner was unbearable. In public statements, Jessica's mother spoke about how she had lost not only her daughter, but also a part of herself. The heartbreak was evident in her voice, and her words resonated with everyone who had been following the case. She had to grapple not only with the pain of Jessica's death, but also with the shame and betrayal that came with the revelation of Stanley's involvement. For her, the justice that had been served could never undo the damage that had been done to her family. Jessica's father, too, made his feelings known in interviews, struggling with the idea that a family member, someone who should have been a protector, had turned out to be the one who had destroyed his daughter's life. Despite the conviction, the hurt remained, lingering in the shadows of every statement made by the family. The loss was irreparable, and the knowledge that Stanley could one day be free only added to their pain. Meanwhile, Stanley Dishon's life inside prison is a far cry from the one he once led. After entering the Kentucky State Penitentiary, he has lived a life marked by the consequences of his actions. He is currently serving his 20-year sentence, but with parole eligibility set for 2028, there is the possibility that he could be released after serving only 16 years. The maximum sentence for his crimes will conclude in 2033, but for now, his fate is tied to the parole board's decisions. Will Stanley serve the full 20 years, or will he be allowed to re-enter society after just 16 years? It remains to be seen, but for Jessica's family, the thought of Stanley returning to the outside world is a nightmare they must contend with for years to come. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. If you were on the parole board, would you approve Stanley Dishon's parole? Why or why not? Let me know in the comments below. This case, with all its twists and turns, raises many questions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of second chances. But can someone who took the life of an innocent young woman ever truly deserve freedom? As we come to the end of Jessica Dishon's tragic story, we are left with a profound sense of loss. A 17-year-old girl, full of promise, was taken from her family far too soon. Her life ended in a brutal and senseless act, and for years, the truth remained buried. It wasn't until 2013, more than a decade after Jessica's murder, that the pieces of this horrific puzzle began to fall into place. Justice, though delivered, was delayed, and in that time, the family was forced to carry the weight of uncertainty and heartbreak. Jessica's story reminds us of how vital it is to remain vigilant and aware, especially when it comes to protecting those we love. The tragic events in Shepherdsville are a reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets lie closer than we could ever imagine. We must ask ourselves, what more can we do to ensure that vulnerable people, especially children, are safeguarded from harm? How can we become a community that doesn't just mourn the victims, but actively works to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place? But before you go, I want to hear from you. What lessons do you think we can learn from this case? How can communities better protect the vulnerable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this story compelling, and if you want to see more cases like this one, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. Together, we can help raise awareness of Jessica's story and, perhaps, prevent another family from suffering the same fate. Thank you for watching.